I am the least racist person. I can't even see the audience because it's so dark, but I don't care who's in the audience. I'm the least racist person in this room.
He pours fuel on every single racist fire. Every single one. Started off his campaign coming down the escalator saying he's going to get rid of those Mexican rapists. He's banned Muslims because they're Muslims. He has moved around and made everything worse across the board.
As the candidates focused on race at last night's debate, Latino voters in Florida are likely to play a deciding factor in the 2020 election. But how they cast their ballots often depends on their country of origin. According to a 2019 estimate by Equus Research, more than half of Florida's eligible Hispanic population are of Cuban or Puerto Rican descent. Mexicans, Colombians, and Dominicans round out the top 5 most common Hispanic ethnicities in the Sunshine State. That specific ethnicity plays a large role in party identification. A midsummer Pew poll found 58% of Cuban Americans nationwide identify as Republicans. That's opposed to 65% of non-Cuban Hispanics who say they are Democrats. For an in-depth look at Latino voters in Florida specifically, I want to bring in Stephanie Valencia. She's the co-founder of She Se Puede and Equus Research, and she joins me now from Washington. Hi, Stephanie. Welcome. Great to have you with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, Stephanie, with 11 days to go, CBS News has Florida as a toss-up. And of course, Cuban American voters will play a major role in determining which candidate wins the state. Cuban Americans are still the largest Latino group there in Florida. They are historically Republican-leaning, as they have long perceived the Republican Party to be more hardline anti-Castro. So tell us, how did Mr. Trump fare with this voting group in 2016? And among those Cuban Americans who voted for him then, do they think that he's done a good job?
Well, I'm really glad you started with the slide that you did, because it makes a really important point that the Hispanic electorate in Florida is not just one electorate. In fact, it's not just Cuban or Puerto Rican. It's Cuban, Puerto Rican, and about 40% of the electorate is actually non-Cuban and non-Puerto Rican. So when we think about the role that the Hispanic electorate will play in a place like Florida, we have to think well beyond the Cuban American vote. That being said, the Cuban American vote over the last, really since Obama was president, had, very record gains in that community, has shifted and changed a lot since 2016, and even since 2016 as we head into 2020. And in our latest round of polling, Joe Biden is across the entire Hispanic electorate in Florida is polling well above Donald Trump. But when it comes to Cubans, he's polling at roughly 39%. That being said, in order to win Florida, and in order to win the Hispanic vote in Florida, you really need to push to the margins of like 40% or more, which Joe Biden will very likely exceed in these closing days among the Cuban American vote. Now, related to your question around why are Cuban Americans supporting Donald Trump, I think there are really 3 factors that we can point to. One is the economy, and whatever perceptions of the health and well-being of the economy, whether or not people are actually feeling that benefit in their own personal lives, they perceive that Donald Trump is doing a good job on the economy. Secondly, there are a number of different factors that we can kind of relate to around year of arrival to this country, or younger versus older Cuban Americans. Specifically, were you born here in the United States and are of Cuban descent, or were you born on the island of Cuba? That's a very big distinguisher among support for President Trump. And if you did come from the island, what year did you arrive? Post-1993 arrivals are actually a very interesting case study, because they were the ones who supported Barack Obama, but have kind of faltered and switched over to Trump somewhat over the last 10 years. So it's a very interesting group of people that is not super solid in their vote choice, and again went from Obama to Trump. And then the third is, the messaging that you've heard from Donald Trump and conservatives on the right around socialism, and the media ecosystem that they have built in South Florida through radio and digital has really hammered home that message of socialism that has stuck and solidified certain parts of the Cuban electorate.
Right, that is interesting. That messaging does seem to have made inroads. So do Democrats have room to grow among Florida's Cuban American voters, especially, as you pointed out, the younger generations who were born here and certainly seemed, at least in 2016, to be less conservative than their parents? I don't know if that's shifting as they themselves get older. But is there room for Democrats to cut into that pretty solid Cuban American voting bloc in Florida?
Absolutely. We estimate that there's roughly 40% of the Cuban American electorate in Florida that is up for grabs. And we believe, and we've seen with the kind of deluge of television and radio and digital spend that we're seeing in the state of Florida, that Joe Biden and progressives are talking to those voters in addition to Republicans. And so those voters are very much up for grabs. And again, they're made up of those U.S.-born Cuban Americans who tend to be younger, and then those who came after 1993. And there's a huge conversation to be had with them, even on the economy. The current state of the economy right now, kind of given where we are with COVID on healthcare and the state of healthcare in this country today and the state of COVID and handling of COVID are all places where Democrats can have a very proactive conversation with these voters, because issues like access to quality healthcare, the state of the small businesses and COVID and the state of the economy right now can all be laid at Donald Trump's, and the blame can be laid at Donald Trump's feet. Whether or not people are actually communicating that message to Cuban Americans to help persuade them to vote for Joe Biden is what we need to see in these last days of the election.
Stephanie, as you pointed out, Hispanic voters in Florida are certainly not a monolith, and your research also focused on the 40% of Hispanic voters there who are neither Cuban nor Puerto Rican. You've dubbed them the LATAM vote. Why are these voters not studied as much, and how crucial are they for Joe Biden to win Florida?
They are absolutely crucial to his path to victory in Florida. And, we often think about the Hispanic electorate in Florida in very binary terms. You're either Cuban or you're Puerto Rican. And each of those subgroups only make up, as you can see, 29% and 27% of the population. But 40% of the electorate is this LATAM vote, which is, Mexican, Colombian, Venezuelan. And often we hear a lot about in the news about Venezuelan voters in Florida and the part of the electorate they make up. It's actually a relatively small share. We believe that the conversation about Venezuela is often used as a proxy war to solidify the Cuban American Republican base in Florida. But the LATAM voters, supporting Joe Biden right now at 60 plus percentage points, he obviously has a lot of room to grow in terms of that support among that group, and to increase that support and turnout among Latin American voters who, represent a very large share of the electorate in Florida and who are predispositioned to support candidates like Joe Biden. And so if I were spending money and thinking about these final days of the election, I would spend money and trying to find how to reach and engage and increase support among that group, because it's almost certain to yield in a vote for Joe Biden.
Okay, let's dive specifically into male Hispanic voters, Stephanie, because the New York Times, as Jennifer Medina, had a fascinating piece about the so-called macho allure of President Trump among Latino men. It is especially high among male Mexican voters, apparently. What do you make of that, and is that something that your research bears out?
Well, I think this trend we're seeing among Hispanic men is something that we're seeing across a lot of different subgroups of younger men of color and younger men generally. And so I think Democrats are going to really have to study this trend after this election cycle, because I really think there are three driving factors to understanding this. One is their belief that Trump is handling the economy well. And again, whether or not their own personal economic situation is faring better than it was before, they think he is doing a good job. Second is they believe in this kind of like Trump intrigue, which is, the businessman that he is, the success that they feel like he's been able to accomplish, and that they also want to see for themselves and for their families. And so I think that is something that they often identify with him as well. And I think just his cult of personality and his take no prisoners kind of attitude is something else that they very much relate to. And so I think those three things really add up to what I call Trump intrigue, which is an interest in and understanding and kind of maybe supporting him generally. But in a place like Arizona, which, Jenny's story really focused on, when we look at Hispanic males who are intrigued by Trump, 40% of them may say, especially of younger Hispanic men, say that they support or are favorable to Donald Trump. But when you ask if they are actually going to vote for him, only 25% say that they will consider actually voting for him. So you see this big gap between their intrigue and interest in who he is and what he represents, and whether or not they can actually stomach going to cast their vote for them. So the likelihood of them actually staying home feels pretty high, because they may not be fired up about Joe Biden either, but they're not necessarily ready to go cast their ballot for Donald Trump.
Very interesting. You talk about voter turnout. Do you see in Florida that the Latino voter across the board is excited to cast a vote for this election?
We're seeing super high levels of motivation. We finished a poll at the end of September, and what we've seen in the news here very much reflects what we are seeing in our polling, which is levels of motivation are very high in Florida among the Hispanic electorate. So you see people who are very motivated. Cuban Americans are historically very motivated to vote, and they turn out in high numbers in proportion to their part of the population. But we're seeing those high levels of motivation across Puerto Ricans and non-Cuban, non-Puerto Ricans as well. And I think you can see that reflected in the long lines of people standing in the rain for hours on end to cast their vote and to vote early. In a place like Florida, I think that motivation will continue over these last 11 days, and I think you'll continue to see those long lines on Election Day.
All right, Stephanie Valencia of Equus Research, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
The Trump campaign admits it is recording people dropping their ballots in drop boxes in the crucial swing state of Pennsylvania. The campaign argues the goal of its surveillance in Philadelphia is to catch any wrongdoing. The state's attorney general says this could point to illegal voter intimidation, although city elections officials say they are unsure the videotaping is breaking state law. Earlier this month, a federal judge rejected the Trump campaign's lawsuit to block the use of drop boxes in Pennsylvania. Like in other states, significantly more Pennsylvania Democrats have requested mail-in ballots compared to registered Republicans. The president has claimed, without evidence, voting by mail could lead to fraud. Pennsylvania's Supreme Court has ruled counties cannot reject ballots because the signature does not match the signature on the voter's registration form. The ruling is a victory for the state's top election official, who had asked the court to back her up in a legal dispute against President Trump's campaign and Republican lawmakers. Pennsylvania's Attorney General called the decision a win for voters. The country is seeing a record surge of mail-in ballots this year because of the coronavirus pandemic. Pennsylvania is a crucial state in the upcoming election. The CBS News Battleground Tracker currently has the state and its 20 electoral votes leaning to Joe Biden. So a reminder, for more information on how to vote in your state, head to cbsnews.com/vote. A newly unsealed deposition offers new insight into Jeffrey Epstein's close associate and former girlfriend, Ghislaine Maxwell. Maxwell gave sometimes evasive answers in the 2016 deposition, taken as part of a civil suit by Epstein accuser Virginia Giuffre. Maxwell is accused of recruiting underage girls for Epstein's alleged sex trafficking ring and participating in the sex abuse herself. She has long denied any involvement. CBS correspondent Mola Lenghi is following this case.
According to the deposition, Ghislaine Maxwell says she knew Jeffrey Epstein was a registered sex offender. When asked if she recruited girls on Epstein's behalf, she said, "I don't recruit anybody," and appeared disgusted, saying, "I resent and despise the word recruit." Throughout the testimony, Maxwell dodged questions about Epstein's alleged abuse of underage girls and repeatedly called Epstein accuser Virginia Giuffre a liar. Maxwell, defending herself, said, "I can't think of anything I have done that is illegal." While being questioned about her initial meeting with Giuffre, Maxwell's anger appeared to boil over, and she harshly pounded the table, later apologizing for the behavior. Giuffre alleges Epstein and Maxwell sexually abused her when she was underage and lent her out to their friends. In a July interview with CBS This Morning, Giuffre said Epstein was a sick pedophile, but Maxwell was the mastermind.
She is even worse than Epstein. She put it this way. Epstein was Pinocchio and she was Geppetto.
Pulling the strings?
Yep, she was pulling the strings. She had his money. He had her contacts. They made a great group that way. But Ghislaine was much more conniving and smart than Epstein ever was.
At one point during the deposition, Giuffre's attorney, Sigrid McCauley, appeared to ask Maxwell about the now infamous picture of Giuffre and the UK's Prince Andrew. Giuffre says she had sex with the prince at Maxwell's London home that night. The prince has repeatedly denied Giuffre's allegations, and Maxwell called Giuffre's account of the incident an obvious lie. In the deposition, Maxwell said Giuffre characterized things took place in my bathroom, in the bathtub itself. The tub is too small for any type of activity whatsoever.
What was your takeaway of Ghislaine as a person?
She's really intelligent. She's perhaps a bit too clever. She obviously believes that she should give up nothing.
CBS News legal analyst Ricky Kleeman says the deposition could create problems for Maxwell at trial.
Anything particularly damaging?
The jury is going to wonder why she doesn't have some kind of story that is other than everyone else is lying. In addition, pounding on the table does not get you anywhere in a criminal court.
In a statement to CBS News, Virginia Giuffre's attorneys say Maxwell's deposition is only a fraction of the evidence against her. And as more is released, it'll become increasingly apparent, they say, why Maxwell and other Epstein enablers fought so hard to keep these documents sealed. Maxwell has been here at this federal prison in Brooklyn since July, awaiting her trial, which is scheduled for next year. Mola Lenghi, CBS News, Brooklyn, New York.
Fighting for the world they grew up in. Coming up next, the young climate activists who are literally trying to save the planet. A preview of our CBSN Originals Reverb Generation Climate. You're streaming CBSN Always On. Uber and Lyft are vowing to weigh all legal options after a California appeals court ordered they must reclassify their drivers as employees. The court upheld a lower court ruling saying both companies must abide by the state's gig work law that would allow drivers to receive company benefits. San Francisco's city attorney says both companies have pocketed millions of dollars by classifying drivers as independent contractors. The ruling will not take effect until after Election Day. The ride-sharing companies have a measure on the ballot that would make them exempt from the gig work law. Say goodbye to extra space on Southwest Airlines. The company announced it will start booking middle seats beginning December 1st. Since May, the company limited the number of seats sold because of the coronavirus pandemic. The airline says it has measures in place to protect passengers from the virus. That includes enhanced cleanings, a mask mandate, and new boarding and deplaning procedures. Southwest also says passengers will be notified if a flight is full. They will be able to rebook for free if they don't feel comfortable on a full flight. This Sunday, CBSN Originals will premiere the first episode of an all-new season of Reverb Generation Climate, which follows two young climate activists on their mission to fight the climate crisis before time runs out.
They grew up witnessing a rapidly changing climate.
I always talked about climate change with my friends at the lunch table. I was like the weird weather kid. We grew up and seen this everywhere. We want to organize and spread the message that this is urgent and this is our time period.
Now this generation is coming of age.
We lived here and it's getting worse. I get lightheadedness and dizziness and it sucks.
The climate crisis makes racial injustice more unjust. It makes poverty more brutal. Our generation is able to make those connections. I think that's what gives us strength.
But can these young activists mobilize the nation?
Every one of us standing here has an opportunity to reject the climate apocalypse.
In what they call a race against time.
That is insane. I kind of wish I could unsee what I saw now.
They're trying to scare people. Children today have this anxiety about a climate crisis.
And you're saying it's unfounded?
It is absolutely unfounded.
It's like you're in a void that no one can hear you. Like you're screaming about something, but no adult is paying attention. These are our lives. This is our future. We are already reaching tipping point. and time is ticking.
And CBSN Originals executive producer Adam Yamaguchi joins me now for more on that documentary. Adam, welcome. Great to have you with us. So why did you find that Gen X is mobilizing so broadly for climate change? What is motivating this generation?
Well, I think as you heard in some of the sound bites that we just played, there's a real sense of urgency. Past generations have always looked at climate change as, say, the number 5 or the number 6 issue on their minds as they approach elections. And what we're seeing and hearing from young people today is that this is one of the top, if not the top issues. Jerome Foster, who is one of the people that we followed in this documentary, first learned about climate change when he was 6 years old. And he remembers at the time that he thought, well, I'm just a child. The adults will take care of this. By the time I'm an adult, things will be relatively under control. And for the next 12 years, he saw that there was a lot of talk and not much action. He's now just turned 18 and ready to vote for the first time. And this is foremost on his mind. And the many other people who are like him, who grew up hearing about climate change and seeing the impacts for themselves.
Adam, I'm glad you brought up voting because obviously we're on the cusp of an election. What does all of this mean for the upcoming election, do you think? Were most of the people you interviewed for the documentary of voting age?
Yeah, so the two main young activists that we followed, as I mentioned, Jerome just turned 18 earlier this year. We also followed another activist, Miguel Escoto, in El Paso, Texas, who's 23 years old. So yes, they are taking their concerns about the environment and the climate crisis to the polls. And, I think what is, I guess, the million-dollar question in all of this is, they represent perhaps the most unreliable of voting blocks. Young people typically, they may express their concerns, but they may not necessarily go to the polls. But indications are that young people are far more energized and mobilized to actually getting out to vote in this election, and climate issues are really top of mind for them. We're coming off the 2018 midterm elections, which saw record levels of participation, particularly amongst young people. And so I think pollsters will point to the fact that they are expecting, based on what they're hearing, to see record levels set yet again.
And so, Adam, how have you seen the messaging around climate change evolve over the years? I mean, there were some people that you interviewed in that documentary who still don't seem to think it's that big of a deal.
Sure. I mean, there certainly is still a lot of denial and deflection in certain corners, but the conversation has shifted from one of arguing about whether climate change is actually happening and whether humans have a role in that, to what are we going to do about this? How do we transition our economy to an economy that's predicated on green energy, moving away from fossil fuels? And there's a real sense of, again, urgency. When I interviewed Jerome for this documentary, we were talking about the fact that there were multiple named storms, hurricanes, swirling in the Gulf of Mexico while parts of California were on fire. These are kids who are growing up watching these images play out on the screen, and what prior generations might have sort of relegated to sci-fi movies, some of this is actually playing out now, and that really does have an impact on the conversation. I think the other interesting thing that we heard quite a bit of in the field was intersectionality, which is the idea that addressing climate issues cannot be divorced from addressing some issues around social justice, race, gender, social status, and class. Mm-hmm. These are all things that need to be addressed in tandem in order to combat the climate crisis. And a couple of the activists rightfully pointed out that it is oftentimes communities of color that are most impacted by pollution, access to clean water and air, and ultimately by the ravages of climate change.
Absolutely true and very interesting. All right, well, Adam Yamaguchi, thank you so much for joining us, and great work with Generation Climate.
Thank you, Tanya.
CBSN Originals is kicking off a new season of Reverb with Generation Climate, streaming right now at cbsnews.com/environment. Big Ten football will return this weekend, even as the coronavirus surges in the Midwest. The conference will open its season with Wisconsin and Illinois tonight, followed by a full slate of games on Saturday. The Big Ten will attempt to play a protracted schedule of 8 conference games in 8 weeks. Any game canceled because of a COVID outbreak will be deemed a no contest. The Big Ten had initially postponed the season until the spring because of the pandemic. Tonight is Game 3 of the 2020 World Series. The Tampa Bay Rays knotted up the series with the Los Angeles Dodgers on Wednesday with a 6-4 victory. All games are being played in Arlington, Texas, with limited fans because of the pandemic. Expect a pitching duel tonight. Both teams are sending out their aces, Charlie Morton for the Rays and Walker Buehler for the Dodgers. The first pitch is at 8:10 p.m. Eastern. Coming up in our next hour, President Trump and Joe Biden's final face-off before Election Day. We break down the key moments from last night's debate. 2 massive wildfires on a collision course in Colorado. The efforts to keep the damage and death toll to a minimum. And Generation Z is more stressed out in the coronavirus era than anyone else. And the pandemic is not the only reason. Those stories and much more when we return. You are streaming CBSN. With just 11 days to go until Election Day, President Trump and Joe Biden are back on the campaign trail following the final presidential debate. The candidates were questioned on a wide range of topics, from the economy to immigration and more. This debate had much more policy talk and far fewer interruptions than the last. The first topic of the night was the coronavirus, where Joe Biden slammed the Trump administration for its response.
220,000 Americans dead. If you hear nothing else I say tonight, hear this. Anyone who's responsible for not taking control, in fact, not saying I take no responsibility initially, anyone who's responsible for that many deaths should not remain as President of the United States of America.
But President Trump said a vaccine is coming in weeks and defended his administration's response to the pandemic.
2.2 million people modeled out were expected to die. We closed up the greatest economy in the world in order to fight this horrible disease that came from China. It's a worldwide pandemic. It's all over the world. You see the spikes in Europe and many other places right now. If you notice, the mortality rate is down 85%. The excess mortality rate is way down and much lower than almost any other country.
For more on this, I want to bring in Leslie Sanchez and Joel Payne. Leslie is a CBS News political analyst and Republican strategist. Joel is a CBS News political contributor and Democratic strategist. Welcome to both of you. Great to see you both. Leslie, let me start with you. Polling shows that President Trump is trailing behind Joe Biden. But did the president do what he needed to do last night to change that trajectory?
The president was effective. That is really going to be determined. How effective? Is it enough to get him across the finish line in some of those battleground states? It's going to be really close. And the reason I say that, this isn't about just putting points on the board. It's about some key areas. The president looked calm, measured, looked presidential, and he looked like he wanted the job. He was really fighting for it. And you contrast that against Biden, who was a much darker candidate, and looking at his watch, he looked not only defensive, vague, but also somebody who wasn't as excited and kind of coasting to the finish line. That's just stylistic, but there were some major gaps on the issues of oil and gas, what Biden wants to do in terms of a rapid reduction, it sounds like, of fossil fuels, his issues on immigration, kind of the open borders concept. So some of those really landed in terms of Trump's ability to crystallize that around states that are going to matter, Texas, Pennsylvania, and so on. So it's going to be interesting to see, but I do expect that gap to close.
Joel, what do you think? Do you want to respond to what Leslie just said about whether the Trump administration or the Trump campaign was ever able to pull some sound bites from the debate that will help it? Or, do you think that Joe Biden did what he needed to do to maintain his apparent lead in the polls?
Well, probably the most interesting takeaway from me, Tanya, was the fact that that rule, that muting the microphones rule, that actually, I think, helped Donald Trump. And I think his campaign probably is sitting there kind of smacking their head saying, if he would have just listened to us the first time, maybe he wouldn't have dug himself such a big hole in that first debate 2 weeks ago. I think both candidates performed better. I think what Trump needed was to perform better and for Biden to be bad. I don't think Biden was bad. I thought Biden was good and passed the test. And I thought both candidates were able to land rhetorical punches that are going to help them down the stretch. I think nothing changed in terms of the trajectory of the race. I do think that there are some things that both candidates need to clean up, like Donald Trump cheering on young children in cages. And yes, Joe Biden needing to clarify his answers around fracking and climate change and things of that nature.